E te whanau te kraiti tēnā koutou katoa. Kei te mihi atu ki a koutou e aku rangatira, e aku whanaunga tēnā koutou. E te rangatira e Helen tēnā koe mo te mihi mahana ki au e tēnei rā. A tēnā koutou e te kuia, e waiora, a tēnā koe, a tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you in the name of Christ. Greetings to you on this wonderful day of ours, this national day. Greetings to you as we gather here in this wonderful building. I used to come here as a child. My father was the missioner up at Holy Sepulchre, and we had a close relationship with St. Matthew's, with John Mullane. The 1980s were an exciting time for the church. All time should be an exciting time for the church, but we're actually active about it then, as I'm sure we can be again one day. And so we used to come up here to this hotbed of radical thought and theology, and they would come across as well. So it's wonderful to be here again as a type of adult here again as well, renewing these connections. And my mother brought me to keep me in line, just in case. So for both of us, it's an honour to be here to bring back memories and to renew connections. I also come to you on this day wearing a few hats, and to be honest, I get a bit confused about my hats at the moment. Just 2 weeks ago, I started a new role lecturing at the University of Auckland. I'm teaching history and theological and religious studies. They wanted something really, catchy, so they made it the longest title possible. And I'm not sure what that second half involves, to be honest, yet, so we'll find out. And it's been an exciting beginning, to be honest. I straight away had a run-in with one of our wonderful media personalities, Mike Hosking, who, strangely enough, I was invited onto his show last week, then uninvited, then re-invited, then uninvited, and then silence beyond that. And I'm quite glad, because Kim Hill was scary enough. So I'm here this morning with an invitation, a generous invitation from Helen to talk to you this Waitangi weekend, to talk about our faith and how it works with our nation and with this very special weekend we have here in front of us. But I'd also like to wear my historian's hat a little bit, and my promotional hat, because some of this material is coming in the book that'll come out next year. So this is more a branding exercise than an advertising exercise. We're so far out, but with Bridget Williams' books. So really on a history of the Māori Anglican Church, really about iwi engagement with Christianity. What did that mean from us from a Māori perspective? And it really ties in with our reading today and with our experience as a nation, the experience of our church. And I'd like to start off in the 1940s. Now, I'm not going to make any generalisations, but does anyone here know anything about Bishop Simpkin, who was Bishop of Auckland in the 1940s and 50s? We've got one hand, two hands. Come on, be honest. We've got a few more out there. There was Simpkin House over on Waiheke Island, which my mother used to go to as a young woman. Bishop Simpkin was the bishop of the diocese when the diocese was a huge part of Auckland society and when the Anglican Church was, well, people knew it existed, let's put it that way. Bishop Simpkin became bishop in about 1940. Bishop Simpkin, and I've got to tell you too, this story that I'm going to share, it's not the nicest story. It's a difficult story. As I wrote this story, I literally, at my feet, had a communion kit. Bishop Simpkin retired in the 1960s, moved to Taupo. My father was a curate there in the parish, and Bishop Simpkin was something of a mentor and gave him his old communion kit. That communion kit sat at my feet and reminded me of Bishop Simpkin's ministry as I wrote this story. So, before we get into the good guys and the bad guys of history, it's always complex and nuanced. The Māori church in the north, and from Auckland north, well actually a large part of the north, including Waikato and Taranaki, was established by Māori, mainly for Māori in its origins. And it went through various phases, various challenges of our history, which I don't have time to get into all of today. But in 1923, a bishop from southern India, Bishop Azaria, came to visit. This is one amazing man. He came, He was supposed to come to talk about mission. He was going to go and talk to the diocese. He was going to fundraise for his diocese and his amazing work that he was doing in southern India. He spent 1 hour with Māori from the north over at where the Cathedral St Mary's was in a hui. Just the Māori and him. They came out of this hui in 1923 and said, right, that's it. We're going to set up our own committee. We're going to have our own structure. We're going to celebrate who we are as Māori. That was the beginning of an organisation, of a structure called Komiti Tumuaki that still exists through to today, which is how the Māori part of the church in the north organises itself. It's the standing committee of the church, was inspired by this amazing man, by his theology, by his way of viewing the world, and by the inspiration he gave to Māori here. Komiti Tumuaki met from 1923, and all their proceedings were held in Te Reo Māori, because that's what we spoke, that's who we were. Nothing was in English. We thought as Māori. We viewed the world as Māori. Of course, we used a Christian lens, but we were Māori. We were who God made us. We used the language that God had given us. We used the values, the ideas that God had created us to express, to see the world. Bishop Simpkin came in as bishop in 1940. One of his first acts very early on in his episcopacy was to come and sit down with Komiti Tumuaki. He sat down at their first meeting. He sat in the chair, pushed aside Canon Kiritini, who'd run the organisation since 1923, and started speaking in English. This is the first English that had been spoken in Komiti Tumuaki, and said, I don't know what this organisation thinks it is, but I disagree with its very existence and purpose. It will no longer exist. It will certainly no longer use the Māori language as a medium. You'll no longer meet on marae because that's not helpful. You're too persuaded by your people. You will now go and do things in the way I want you to. He also had this amazing plan. He was quite the visionary in a scary way, to grab young people from the north and send them to places like King's College, where they could learn to be good Christians without being influenced by their own Māoritanga. Quite a scary little vision he had. This was Bishop Simpkin's vision for Māori. There was another man, though, one of my ancestors, Apirana Ngata, Sir Apirana Ngata. He was a great leader of Māoridom. He was an amazing man. Art, culture, economics, trade, you name it. Apirana Ngata was an expert in it. Politician, Minister of Native Affairs, an amazing man, and also a very dedicated Anglican and lay leader of the Māori Church. He said this situation is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that our people in the north are being oppressed like this, that our people are not allowed to express who they are, how they wish to be. And he went basically to war with Bishop Simpkin. For example, he coined the term the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill had just used it, so he thought he'd borrow it. The Iron Curtain of the Auckland diocese, behind which Māori were struggling, being oppressed and suffering. And there's a real truth to this. We were no longer allowed to use our language. We're no longer allowed to be how God made us. It was an iron curtain in many ways. In World War II, the Māori bishop came up here to confirm Māori soldiers going across to fight and to die. Bishop Simpkin said, I disapprove of this. They hopped on the train, they went to Rotorua where he could confirm them, then they came back and shipped off. This was how Māori were being treated in this diocese. In 1948, there was a hui in Gisborne. Apirana Ngata, apart from anything else, was amazing with media. He would have done amazing things with Mike Hoskins nowadays. He was amazing with media. He used the Auckland Star. He used all the media outlets. He had some good Pākehā journalist friends who would give him good advice and help along the way. He held a hui in 1948 down in Gisborne. He invited James Henare, who later would be Sir James. James Henare was the commander of the Māori battalion in World War II at one stage. James Henare was an amazing man, another amazing man, a hero, a war hero, a leader, a scholar, just amazing. He invited him to come from the north, from behind the Iron Curtain, and he applauded them. He got the whole hui to stand up and applaud this man for having emerged from behind the Iron Curtain. See, he was a great, he knew how to play the media. He would have been amazing on Twitter too, tāpirana. He said to the Auckland Star, I am an old man and have lived a long time. See, that's how you get the heartstrings going. But this is one of the most pathetic things in connection with our people I have ever known. We are very disturbed about what is happening with our kin in the church in the north. Apira Ngata was playing this game through the media. Auckland Diocese, though, being Auckland Diocese, some things change, some things don't, launched a vigorous defence of Bishop Simpkin in the media as well. Nothing new under the sun, really. They declared that his spokespeople declared through the newspapers that there is no one in the church in New Zealand who loves the Māori people more than Bishop Simpkin does. In his diocese, he will tolerate, though, no sign of the colour bar which some would erect between Māori and Pākehā. He would have fitted right into the One New Zealand Foundation really, really well. And also that they also said there is no such thing as a Māori church any more than there is a Pākehā church, which, is quite debatable to Māori. It's a worldview, it's a privilege. Our way is the way. Your way is another way that we will not accept. They also attacked Sir Apirana, said, although he's always sought peace between the two races in public affairs, and yet he would appear to advocate segregation in spiritual matters. All this language keeps popping up all through the history of our church and comes to fruition a bit later on, and it's still language you'll find today, floating around Waitangi Day in particular. Now I'd like to bring in this church, St Matthew's. The vicar here at that time in 1948, he was high profile, aren't they always, here at St Matthew's, was the Reverend Ernest Blackwood Moore. He stood here, it would have been in this pulpit, I imagine, in 1948, in response to these allegations and preached on the moral decline of Māoris. He revealed to his congregation, this was reported in the Star, and the Star had a big readership at the time. He reported that, amongst other things, he could prove that Māori were neglecting their young, that he understood there was inbreeding among the Māoris in parts of North Auckland in order to qualify for the family allowance. And relating to Ngata, he said that Ngata was enabling the prostitution of a noble race for political ends. He also proclaimed the destructive influence of socialism on Māori moral well-being, preached here in this pulpit in 1948. And it was widely reported, his sermon, because he was a high-profile member of the clergy and the church was a high-profile institution in Auckland society at the time. So Apira Ngata waged this war for liberation for the Māori in the north. He received, and there's some beautiful notes in here, he received a letter from a kuia, a Pākehā layperson, Mrs. Eileen Rawls, a laywoman. She wrote him this lovely handwritten note on behalf of herself and her husband, which I love even more. She said that they've been invited to a service at Mototau in the north. You've probably never been there. It's a beautiful place, but in the middle of nowhere in the north. It's where James Henare came from. She was invited by Sir James, or James Henare, Colonel James Henare at the time, to go to a confirmation service, which the bishop took that year, just around the time of these incidents. She said that James Henare had to sit there in the congregation of his own church that his own ancestors had built while Bishop Simpkin preached. Bishop Simpkin said that church services should be conducted in English, and that if the Māori people wish to speak their native tongue in church, then they should revert to primitive ways. For example, they should not have modern European conveniences such as radios, motor cars, etc. Mrs. Rawls said that making him, James Henare, sit there in his own church and listen to this and not being able to reply was not cricket in her view. But there were some beautiful responses as well. So it's not to say goodies and baddies. People had various views on what the bishop was doing, but I'd also have to say he was hugely supported amongst the diocese and amongst Auckland and New Zealand society. It was a fairly good snapshot of another one of our peaks of assimilation, another one of our peak racism moments in this country that have always happened and always will happen in various ways. In our gospel reading today, Jesus goes out on the boat with fishermen and says, put out your nets. And Simon Peter says to him, well, what's the point? We've already tried. We're not going to catch anything. Why bother? And Jesus said, just put your nets out. So they put the nets out and they catch an amazing haul. So amazing, in fact, that these fishermen, these people who know fish, who know the water, who know their business, Simon Peter falls down and says, yes, I should have believed, I should have understood. Jesus is saying, do your business. If you don't, what's the point of existing? I look at stories like this from our church and I think, why did we exist? What is the point of a church that behaves like this? What is the point of a church that does not believe, does not understand its purpose is to catch fish, is to do what it's set up to do? What is the point of that institution? From Simpkins' time, we went even further. By the 1970s, our membership as the Anglican Church was the biggest it would ever be. Huge numbers, huge numbers. It was kind of pre-television. What else are we going to do on a Sunday? My grandparents, my Pākehā grandparents are proud Anglicans. They take me along to Holy Trinity Church in Otahu every Wednesday, and we do the Book of Common Prayer service. They love their church. They love the community. They love the diocese. It was a huge part of their identity. Our churches were beautiful places, gave out a beautiful message. But when it came to some of the big things in our society, when it came to, say, Waitangi, when it came to who are we, how do we relate to one another, what was the point of our existence? If we weren't willing to speak out for the oppressed, the poor, the marginalised, why bother? Were we the biggest social club the world had ever seen? Were we the biggest conservative? Were we the National Party sitting on a Sunday, or the Labour Party sitting on a Sunday, or just a party sitting on a Sunday? What was the point if we weren't willing to go fishing? In the 1980s, though, the 1970s, Māori continually protested within the church. We sought our mana motuhake, our self-determination. We always have. We sought our rangatiratanga. In the 1970s and 1978, the Bishop of Aotearoa, who'd been set up as a suffragan bishop in the 1920s, a powerless bishop, went on to have a modicum of power. In the 1980s, we continually pressed and people started to listen. The movement for justice started within our church. We learned how to fish again. We took the courage to cast our nets out. And in 1992, we passed Te Pauhere, the Constitution. We made a radical overhaul of our structure, world-leading. We took that prophetic step to say, the Treaty of Waitangi, which we as a church helped to bring through to birth, we need to accept this as a covenant. We need to accept justice. We need to reread Scripture and understand who we are in this land. We cast our nets out and we dragged in a huge haul. So huge, in fact, I think it overwhelmed us a little bit. I think we're still a bit stunned about what we've done. We're still a bit unknowing. We still stare at all these fish that, to be honest, now are starting to rot a bit in the bottom of the boat. We're starting to forget what the purpose was of that fishing, of that haul. Yesterday was Waitangi Day. Where was our church? Where were our church leaders? Where were our prophetic statements about what's happening? Partly, we struggle to cut through the media mess, through the social media mess. Of course, everyone has that challenge. But where were we? Where are we now? We could apply this argument, say, to sexuality, to human sexuality. We send our archbishops off. They have some mysterious meeting somewhere in some mysterious room. They come back with mysterious utterances that none of us really understand, and we mysteriously exclude a huge part of our church, of our worldwide communion. Was that fishing? Or was that just an exercise in rowing our boat out, saying, oh, too hard, rowing it back to shore, coming back empty? I think it was the latter, unfortunately. Because it's complicated, because our archbishops had a difficult job. It's complicated. Waitangi Day is complicated. Yes, the Prime Minister should have gone to Waitangi, but then, Ngāpuhi were having some internal divisions and sending out mixed messages. Well, look, if the Prime Minister and ministers are feeling vulnerable, they have a whole army at their disposal. They have billions of dollars. The idea that the Prime Minister is vulnerable is slightly ridiculous. He could just turn up in an Orion and some tanks if he felt like it, whereas Ngāpuhi could turn up as Ngāpuhi. So the idea of the powerful being afraid of the weak and using that idea to justify their actions, I don't think that should hold water for very long. And then Isaiah speaks to us. Isaiah speaks to us about complications and clarity. It was in the year that King Uzziah died. King Uzziah's dead. Twitter's full of it. Facebook, every post about King Uzziah's death. Oh, it's just complicated everything. We can't do anything now because we've got the tangi, then we've got the renegotiate the whole royal family lineage, and the politics is going to shift, and the finances, and let's not bother. Things are complicated. Isaiah was living in a world where politics was important, where complications happened. But he had this vision in his head. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Despite the complications, despite Ngāpuhi, and I love Ngāpuhi, I love my Ngāpuhi in-laws, despite Ngāpuhi, being who they are, despite the complications of race, despite the complications of protest and argument and the difficulties of being Aotearoa New Zealand in the 21st century, we as Christians should be clear in our calling. God is calling us. God is sending us out to do the work we're sent out to do, not to come back empty-handed. God is saying to us, you can be prophetic. You can talk to the weak, the marginalized. You can speak for them. You can speak with them. You can take this message to the powerful. Don't be afraid. I'll give you the words. I'll put them on your tongue. We have a history of being able to do that. We can do that again. If we don't, we should just close up. And don't worry, it might be happening anyway. And the two are related. What is the point of us fretting as a church about our future if our future involves doing nothing? So this Waitangi, even though we sit here complicated as a nation, we should remember as a church we have done the prophetic actions that can show the way. I'm going to take a whole lecture with my undergrad class on the Anglican structure, on our complicated history, on our messy history, and I'm going to say to them, the most conservative institution in this country, the institution that had Bishop Simpkin in its midst, could go and do this. It could share power. It could say our Pākehā way is not the only way. It could say God created us all in God's image and we need to respect and live that out. And if we did that once, we can do that again. I leave us with those words. I rungi te ngoti atua, matua tama wairua tapu. Āmine.